very happy to be here with you in your beautiful country of Russia. I am indeed greatly honoured to be invited, and I hope that our day will be a very fruitful one. Before I begin, let me spend a minute or two introducing myself. I come from a small country, just a little dot between England and the United States. We have a population of only 4 million people, and our capital city is the city of Dublin, and I come from the city of Cork, which is about 2.5 hours from Dublin, so we're quite a small country. I live in the town of Cove. It's written C-O-V-H, but it's pronounced C-O-V-E, because it's a Gaelic word. And we have many Russian visitors to this town, because many of the Russian ships come in there to get their supplies and drinking water and so on. So we are great friends with the Russians when they call to see us. This town was the last port of call of the Titanic. In 1913, the Titanic left England, heading to New York, and collected up its last passengers at this spot here, 123 people from Ireland who were emigrating to the United States. This is my university, and we also have a wildlife park about 20 kilometres from the university. The university is in the city of Cork. It is quite an old university. It was built in 1850 during the reign of Queen Victoria, and it was originally called Queen's College Cork, and it was subsequently renamed University College Cork when Ireland got its freedom from England in 1922. We have 20,000, as I say, students in the university. Our most famous professor is George Boole. He was our first professor of mathematics. And those of you who study mathematics or computer science will have learned about Boolean algebra, which is the mathematics behind computer technology. He had a daughter who married Voynich, and Ethel Boole was called Ethel Voynich. I'm not sure if anybody has ever heard of her. Apparently she is quite famous in Russia. She wrote a novel, The Gadfly. Has anybody here ever heard of Ethel Voynich? Many of you have. Good. Well, I bet many of you did not know that she was the daughter of a UCC professor. So that's all I want to say for the introduction, and I will now put on my first presentation. I was hoping I could connect my old computer to here, but that's not possible, and I hope I can follow the instructions in Russian here. So that presentation is gone, and now this is the first presentation here. Now, during this presentation and all the other presentations, you do not need to take any notes. It is far better if you concentrate on what I am saying. I will leave behind all of the presentations, plus the papers to which I refer. I will leave them behind in electronic format. So perhaps they could be put on a website so that they can be downloaded or whatever. Now, I want to start off our first session with that title there, Learning Outcomes, the International Language for Describing Programs in Higher Education. Now, it does not matter what subject you teach. You can see there that I'm in the Department of Education in University College Cork. My first degree was in chemistry and physics. Then I did an MSc in X-ray crystallography, and subsequently I studied for a Master's in Education and a PhD in Education at the University of York in England. And my job in the Department of Education is essentially, number one, teacher training, and number two, providing continuing professional development activities for our professors and for teachers who come to visit us. I will explain about how we train our own professors in the university later on in the presentation. So what do I want to do with you in the first presentation? Firstly, we look at what exactly do we mean by learning outcomes. Secondly, we will look at the reasons why learning outcomes have become the international language of education. Thirdly, we will look at how do I write learning outcomes for modules. Now, let me just explain the word module to begin with. The word module means a short course. So it might be something that you teach over 10 or 12 weeks, whereas the entire course that you might teach over 3 or 4 years to an undergraduate degree, that is called a program. So we are talking about learning outcomes for short courses, which are called module learning outcomes. And we are also talking about learning outcomes for long courses, which are called program learning outcomes. Now, so let's get started. What are learning outcomes all about? If you want to know what anything, any terminology means, we look up various references. So, for example, Morrison Murray in Scotland wrote a book on teaching in higher education, and they describe statements of what students know and are able to do as a result of learning. And if you look up various books and various peer-reviewed journals, you will find that all of the definitions of learning outcomes say much the same thing. And that is one of the reasons why learning outcomes was chosen as the common term to be used in education, as the international language, if you like, because everybody is agreed on the definition and on the meaning of learning outcomes. So a good working definition is as shown there on the screen. They're statements of what a student should know, understand, and be able to demonstrate. Now that word demonstrate or do is a very important word because it helps us to write learning outcomes later on, as we should see. Now, when writing learning outcomes, the Bologna process requires us to write learning outcomes for modules and also for entire programs. In some institutions, the professor gives the learning outcomes at the end of each lecture. Now, that is not too common. I have given courses in something like 30 countries at this stage, and I have only found a few institutions which use this. One of them was the Royal College of Surgeons in my own country, in Dublin. And at the end of each lecture, each professor gives the medical students the learning outcomes for that lecture. In other words, this is what you should be able to do at the end of this lecture. Now, the reason they do that in medicine is because during the lecture, the professors give so much information to the students that very often the students get confused. In English, there is a phrase, cannot see the wood from the trees. In other words, they cannot pick out the essential points. So the professors give the students the learning outcomes for each lecture. But for the Bologna process, we are not required to do this. For the Bologna process, we are required to do two things: write module learning outcomes and write program learning outcomes. Now, it is important that learning outcomes are not some sort of theoretical item. It is important that they are linked to our teaching and learning. And it is vitally important that when we write learning outcomes, everybody should understand what we mean by them. So that's important. And also, when we write learning outcomes, we always must have in the back of our mind, how are we going to assess these learning outcomes? So assessment is a very important aspect of writing learning outcomes. And we'll come back and look at that later on. Now, I want to distinguish between learning outcomes and the meaning of the terms aims and objectives, because very often there is confusion among these terms. Now, the aim of a program or of a short course is a broad sort of statement. It gives the students an idea, an indication of the general direction in which you are moving. So, for example, you might have students in year 1 of your university, and you want to give them an introduction to the topic. So that's an example of an aim, to give students an introduction. In some countries, particularly in the United States, the word aim is commonly called a goal. Now, the word objective is more specific. It gives us a little bit more information. So, for example, you might say, my aim is to lose weight over the next year, but my objective is to lose 1 kilogram this week. Or my aim would be to go to Australia, but firstly, my first objective is to travel to Hong Kong, for example. So objectives are more specific than aims. Now, examples of objectives. Very often, our courses before Bologna were written in terms of aims and objectives. And in our university, we use the term aim to describe the program over 4 years or 3 years. And we use objective to describe each module. But the objectives are not specific enough. We also need to write learning outcomes. But when we write objectives, I want you to look at the type of language that we use to give students an appreciation of something, to give students an understanding of something, to make sure students know something, to make students familiar with. So aims are generally long-term and objectives are specific. You could achieve an objective in a single lecture, or it might take 3 or 4 lectures in order to achieve it. Now, note carefully so the language that we use when writing aims and objectives. Note that the word students always appears, because aims and objectives are written from the point of view of the teacher. Now, that is a very important point. Aims and objectives are written from our point of view. What we as teachers want the students to have, what knowledge and understanding we want to give the students. Now, there are also here on the screen examples of aims. So, to give students an introduction to something, to give students an understanding of something, to give students an appreciation of something, to help students develop knowledge and skills, and so on. Notice again, in every one of the aims and objectives, we use the word students. Now, aims and objectives are part of what we call the teacher-centered approach to teaching and learning. In other words, it is the professor who decides what the aims and objectives of the course they are going to teach. On the other hand, learning outcomes focus on what the student should be able to do at the end of the module or at the end of the program. So that is referred to as the student-centered approach to teaching and learning. Now, the two cannot be separated from each other. And that is why the arrow is going in both directions. Because the aims and objectives that we set up must be linked to the learning outcomes that we write. And I'll give you many examples of this as we go through this presentation. So, in aims and objectives, we're focusing on the teacher, and in writing learning outcomes, we are focusing on the student, specifically what the student should be able to do. Now, because I'm using a different computer, some of the slides go a small bit haywire. So please excuse this photograph being in the wrong place. Now, the Bologna Agreement was signed in 1999. There are now 46 countries that have signed up to it. We will look at some of the key points of the Bologna Agreement in a moment. But if you had to describe the Bologna Agreement in one word, I would use the word clarity. The Bologna Agreement needs to bring about clarity throughout the European higher education on what we expect our students to be able to do when they complete our courses and our degree programs. So we need to describe our qualifications and our qualification structures very clearly. Some people think that the Bologna Agreement is just a European Union initiative. Not at all. There are many countries outside the European Union which have not joined the EU, but which have signed the Bologna Agreement. And Russia is one of them, and you have Georgia, you have Iceland, you have Norway, you have Serbia, and so on. Now, isn't it extraordinary that 46 countries could all come together and agree on a method of describing our qualifications and our qualification structures? So the Bologna process, initially, if you were to look at the literature in education, you would find people writing in, some professors writing papers and saying, I'm not sure if this is such a good idea. I have been teaching this course for 30 and 40 years, and I am an expert in my subject, and why should I change now? Because people around the rest of Europe want me to change. But as time went on, it became obvious that the Bologna process was having some great effects. For example, in improving student mobility. People saw the advantage that if I write the learning outcomes and describe my courses in Ireland in terms of learning outcomes, and the people in Russian universities are doing the same, that immediately gives me a very clear indication of what the course is all about and helps my students to get a good grasp of what the course that they're going to undertake in Russia is all about. So, as time went on, more and more countries started to join the Bologna process from 1999. And now in the education literature, they no longer ask the question, was the Bologna process a good idea? But how can we improve things? How can we make sure that our university and our courses are aligned with the Bologna process? Now, this European higher education area was set up in order to have a system to make it easier to understand qualifications and qualification structures. The structures would be the national framework of qualifications, which I think there is one in Russia now, isn't there? Yeah, grand. And we'll be talking about the national framework of qualifications later on. And it also brought in things like diploma supplements to make it easier to understand these descriptions of qualifications. Now, if you look at the action lines of the Bologna process, numbers 1 and 5 are particularly relevant to this presentation. If you look at the very first action line, you will see the adoption of a system of easily readable and comparable degrees. That is, we must be able to read the description and understand them. One of the jobs that I have each year is to go over to a university in London, in England, where I am external examiner. And when I took up that position first, the first thing I asked of the professors over there was, please show me the programme learning outcomes and the module learning outcomes. And when I read those programme learning outcomes and the module learning outcomes, it became very clear to me what the whole course was all about. So the usefulness of using the same language of learning outcomes is incredibly good. There is also, of course, everything is driven by quality assurance. If we do not have an objective type of description, a clear type of description using learning outcomes, we cannot assess anything which is not clear. So learning outcomes and quality assurance in terms of the evaluation of the merit or worth of programs, these two go hand in hand, learning outcomes and quality assurance. Now, where do learning outcomes, where do they feature in the Bologna process? They first started to be studied in the communiques. They first started to be emphasized in the communiques issued by the education ministers. So, for example, one of their first meetings was in Berlin in 2003, and they made the point that ministers encouraged the member states to elaborate a framework of comparable and compatible qualifications, and they spoke about learning outcomes. And they also, in Berlin, also emphasized learning outcomes. And in the London communique, they emphasized very clearly efforts should concentrate in future on removing barriers to access and progression between cycles and on proper implementation of ECTS based on learning outcomes and student workload. So time and time again, these two words, learning outcomes, began to be emphasized. So way back in 2003, they were pointing the road forward for how we can align our courses with the Bologna process. And in 2012, you can see there in the Bucharest communique, they said that the Bologna reforms have changed the face of higher education. And it says, higher education structures in Europe are more compatible and comparable. They're easier to compare. They talk about students benefiting from a wide variety of educational opportunities, all brought about by the Bologna process, and a building block of the Bologna process is learning outcomes. Now, we started giving training courses in my university in Ireland in 2005. And the first that our professors heard about learning outcomes was when they received an email from the head of quality assurance in the university. And it said, in 2 years' time, all our courses must be described in terms of learning outcomes. And we will be running training courses for our professors. And so in 2005, because I had done a lot of work on learning outcomes as part of my PhD, I was asked by the Director of Quality Assurance if I would become involved in the training of our professors in writing learning outcomes. All of our training courses were organised during lunchtime. We said to our professors, between 1 and 2 o'clock, please come along to the room, we will give you free lunch. So while the professors were drinking their tea and coffee and munching on their sandwiches, we taught them about learning outcomes. And it was a very successful formula, because everybody has to take a lunch break, everybody loves a free lunch, and so lots of people came along to the training courses. And when I started giving the training courses first, I would bring in photocopies of papers from the educational literature. But the professors started by saying to me, "Oh Declan, we haven't time to be reading all these papers. Could you write something short and simple to summarise what you are covering in your book, in what you are covering in your lectures?" So I decided I would write a book just for the training of the professors in my own university. And I called the book Writing and Using Learning Outcomes, a Practical Guide. And we got funding from the Higher Education Authority, our government agency which runs our universities, to publish the book. And we gave a free copy to every professor. As time went on, people began to hear about this book in other countries, and to date it has been translated into a total of 13 languages, and last month that 13 went up to 14 when I was out in Saudi Arabia for the launching of the Arabic translation. So it has been a very successful publication, and it is all free. And as you can see from the screen there, an electronic copy of the book in English is available for free download. So you will have this in your this electronic version. So just click on the link and you will get into the website in my own university where it's available free. And I believe there is also a Russian translation of the book. Olga will be able to clarify where that is available from. Do you know offhand, Olga? Is it?
I don't know. I know that one of our universities translated it before, and just we can't find it so as to edit it from the point of terminology, everything.
Yes.
If we'll find it, or if you have it in Russian, then we can do it.
Yes, okay. But
we'll edit it and put it on the website of Erasmus Plus and Bologna Club and many other organizations.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much.
It's very necessary for us. That is why Bologna Club was responsible for such activity.
Yes, absolutely. Because it is a pity that those people who do not understand English could not come today. But at least if you have it in your own language, it would be very helpful. Because everything that you need to know about writing learning outcomes is in this book. It only runs to 100 pages, but there are lots and lots of examples in the book of how to write learning outcomes. Now, if the translation cannot be found, Olga has such excellent English that I'm sure she will have no trouble in translating it herself. Or if half a dozen people sat down over a few days, you'd have it translated easily enough, I'm sure. So thank you, Olga, for your kind offer to translate the book for us and to locate it. Right, now there is also on the internet, and I will give you a copy of this I have a copy of this electronically on the desktop of this computer here, this PDF. That is a summary of what's in the book, written in collaboration with my former Professor of Education and Norma Ryan. But while it is a summary, it doesn't contain many of the examples that you find very useful. The ECTS system is closely linked to learning outcomes. As you can see there, it was originally set up in 1989 just to cover or to describe transfer from one country to another. So a student from Russia comes to my country, and this student will teach Russian in our secondary schools. Russian is one of the languages, believe it or not, taught in Ireland. We have French, German, Spanish, but we also have Russian, because in recent years an increasing number of Russian speakers have come to Ireland. So students in Russia who have come from Russia will be taught Russian, and also some Irish people, students, learn Russian because we export a lot of food products from Ireland to Russia. So students who would come from a Russian university to my university will need to get recognition in terms of ECTS credits. And so that's the first reason why the ECTS system was set up. But of course it is now expanded not just to bring into account the transfer, but also to allow students to build up these credits over a number of years to facilitate what's called lifelong learning. Now, ECTS is like the common currency. It is what the students achieve or get when they fulfill the learning outcomes. So learning outcomes are like the common language of education, and ECTS is like the common currency. When students undertake a course and achieve the learning outcomes that have been written by the professor, they will get so many ECTS, maybe 5 or 10 or 15 or whatever. So that's how the two are closely linked. And as you can see there from the ECTS User's Guide, ECTS is a learner-centered system. In other words, like learning outcomes, ECTS focuses on what the students can do at the end of the course in achieving it. As you are probably aware, 60 ECTS credits is one full workload. And every one of the Bologna countries now work on this 60 credits. And one ECTS credit involves between 25 and 30 hours of work. Now that's total work. The work that the students spend attending the lectures, doing the assignments, sitting for the examinations, and so on. All of those are ECTS credits in terms of numbers of hours of work. So, ECTS system is learner-centered, and so is the learning outcomes framework system. So the Bologna process, therefore, has brought about what's called a quiet revolution. And there was an interesting report published in 2009 called the FIN report, or the Framework Implementation Network. And there were a number of things that that framework said. But one of the things it says was that Bologna is becoming very successful. That our universities throughout the European higher education are seeing the advantages of the Bologna process. But even those countries that have not signed up to the Bologna process are still interested in learning about these things called learning outcomes. So for example, I have been to Chile in South America on 3 occasions because the universities out in Chile are aligning all their courses to be compatible with the Bologna process. Again, to achieve mobility for their students more easily, and also to make sure that their courses have international recognition. So that is very important. And likewise, the Bucharest communique again emphasized the important place of learning outcomes. But moving on, there was another interesting report called the Assessment of Higher Education Learning Outcomes, the AHELO report. It was published by the OECD, and there are two important points arising from that report. The first one is that there is now a global trend, that learning outcomes have gone way beyond the Bologna process. And also, there is an increased emphasis on teaching, learning and assessment in our universities. Because once you start writing learning outcomes, you have to think about, how will I know if these learning outcomes have been achieved in my students? So learning outcomes are a bit like a catalyst. They help us to become better teachers because they force us to think about our assessment and our teaching and learning activities. And in our second session this morning, I will look at that a bit more closely. So, in the action lines of the Bologna process, where we're talking about easily readable and comparable degrees, that is really putting the focus on learning outcomes. So, we'll just move on now to 2020. And as you can see here, from the 2020 Bologna process, they're talking about what's going to be the vision ahead? What should be the case in 2020? Well, by 2020, as you can see there, we want all of the boxes ticked. We want all of the requirements of the Bologna process to be fulfilled throughout the European higher education area. And so we come to the most important question of today. How do I write learning outcomes? And I have the little bit of green grass there to show you that the faraway hills are green, that the future with learning outcomes is a very bright one. And we are very lucky that a very famous educationalist called Benjamin Bloom has left with us a toolkit to help us to write learning outcomes. Benjamin Bloom was a very interesting character. He did his Bachelor of Education in Penn State University. He then went on to do his Masters of Education. And he moved on then to do a PhD in education in the University of Chicago under a very famous United States professor of education called Ralph Tyler. Now, Bloom was a very interesting character because he was very fascinated by one question which always sprang to mind when he was teaching his students. And this question was, are these students in front of me just sitting there, absorbing the information? Or am I getting these students to think? Am I challenging the students who are sitting in front of me? And so Bloom decided that he would take this problem as his PhD. Bloom, by all accounts, was a very good teacher indeed. And in 1956, he wrote what is probably the most important book ever written in education, ever. If I had to pick out one book of all the books in education that have been written, I would pick this one. Because in 1956, Bloom wrote that the thought processes that our brain goes through is made up of 6 stages. Firstly, we take in the knowledge of the subject. Then we try to understand the material we've taken in. Thirdly, we try to apply our understanding. And then he spoke about stages 4, 5, and 6 And he referred to these as the higher order thinking skills. So analysis, synthesis and evaluation. Analysis, the ability of the student to read through the material and to pick out the important parts. Synthesis, the ability to put these important parts together. And evaluation, the ability to stand back and look at everything that we have studied. And he called this his taxonomy. A taxonomy is just a word in English which means a list in a particular order. Now the interesting thing about this is that it is hierarchical. That is, it is built in a certain order. So, for example, number 2, you cannot have understanding without knowledge. You cannot have application if you don't have understanding and if you don't have knowledge. You cannot have analysis if you don't have knowledge, comprehension, application. So everything was built up in terms of building blocks. And he referred to this in the book that he published as the cognitive domain. The word cognitive from a Latin word cognosco, meaning to think. And Bloom suggested that if we want to get students to operate at these various levels, we ask the students to do something. And I'll give you examples of that now in one moment. Suppose we want to test a student's knowledge of a subject. We would ask them to do certain things. And Bloom, in his book, left a list of what are called action verbs or active verbs. So if we want to test a student's knowledge of something, we ask them to define or describe or label or list or state a fact. They may not have understanding. They may be able to give you back a definition of something that you discussed in lectures. But by asking them to state the fact, you'll at least know that they have the knowledge. Now, if we look at learning outcomes written in the area of knowledge, I want you to look at that list there in front of you for one moment and see, is there anything in common that you see between all of those? Well, if we had time to stop and to discuss things, you might spot 3 things that are in common between all those. First and foremost, I want you to notice they all begin with an active verb. Recall, identify, describe, list, define, outline, describe again. So that's the first rule for writing learning outcomes. The learning outcome must begin with an active verb. That is the most important sentence that I will state today. Learning outcomes must begin with an active verb because learning outcomes are part of the student-centered framework in education. The second thing you will notice is that they go across all different categories. Many of these learning outcomes were written by colleagues in my own universities during training workshops. So this here, recall genetics terminology from biology, identify ethical implications from science, describe why laws change, faculty of law, criteria to be taken into account, caring for a patient, faculty of medicine, what behaviours constituting solicitor client, faculty of law, faculty of humanities, outline the history, faculty of engineering, describe the processes. So that's the second thing I want you to notice. Learning outcomes apply to every subject. And the third thing I want you to notice is that they are all simple sentences. Very simple sentences, nothing complicated. So that the sentence can be understood by you, your colleagues, and most important of all, by the students and by external examiners. Now, moving up to number 2, comprehension. Bloom described this as the ability of the students to understand and to interpret what they've learned. Again, Bloom left behind us a list of action verbs. So if we want to write a learning outcome to test the understanding of students, we will pick one of these verbs. And examples of learning outcomes in the area of comprehension would be differentiate, or identify, or discuss, or predict, and so on and so forth. Again, notice they all have in common an active verb, and they're all simple sentences. Moving up to number 3, application. Here, we are testing the students to apply what they've learned. Once again, Bloom has left us behind a list of active verbs. Now, you do not have to learn off these active verbs because you will have them next to you. So when you are writing the learning outcomes, these active verbs will help you to prompt. They'll give you a prompt or an indication of how to write the learning outcome. Again, examples of learning outcomes in the area of application. I'm going through these fairly fast because you will have a copy of all these in electronic form. Construct, apply, select, show, relate, modify, and so on. Now, moving up then to the higher order thinking skills. When we put down on an examination paper the word analyze, we are testing the students at level 4. We are making it a bit difficult for students to operate in 4, 5, and 6. It's easy to recall information, but it can be quite more difficult to analyze a piece of poetry or a piece of writing or a mathematical problem. Again, Bloom left us with a list of action verbs. Now, if you go back to Bloom's original work, you will find the list is not as long as what I have here. Because when I was writing my own book, I went back to Bloom's original book, and then I followed up over the years what other authors had contributed to Bloom's taxonomy. And I included then more modern listings. So you will find the list of action verbs fairly comprehensive. Everything that you need is there. Now, again, notice in the area of analysis, we're asking people to perform various processes. Now, sometimes you might notice the same word in 2 different types of categories. Now, this is perfectly correct. And let me explain with an example why this is the case. Supposing I give students a problem, and I say, using the formula t equals 2 pi times the square root of L over G, calculate how long it takes for a grandfather clock for the pendulum for 1 complete swing. There, I am getting the students to apply a formula to solve a problem in mathematics. There, I am examining the students at number 3, the application of a formula. However, supposing I were to write on an examination question, do that calculation, but I do not give them the formula. There, the students have to read through the problem, analyze what is required, and decide themselves what is the correct formula to use. At that type of problem, I'm operating at number 4, analysis. So the word calculate can be used in 2 different contexts, depending on whether you want the students to apply their knowledge or whether you want the students to analyse data to find out which is the correct formula to use. Now, examples of analysis, you can see them: analyse, compare, debate, identify, calculate again, critically analyse, and so on. Again, notice they're all simple sentences, nothing complicated at all. And so we're nearly at the top of the taxonomy. Now we're in the area of synthesis. And here we hope that students will have the ability to pull together the various strands of what we have covered. And examples of action verbs in the area of synthesis would be as I showed there. And examples of learning outcomes in the area of synthesis: propose solutions, assemble sequences, integrate concepts, summarise is a great word to use, and organise a patient education programme. And finally, we get to the top of Bloom's taxonomy. And here we are hoping that students will be able to stand back and look at everything that they have studied in your course or module and make sense of it. And again, if we look at the various action verbs that Bloom has left behind for us, we can again write examples of learning outcomes in the area of evaluation. Now, writing learning outcomes so is quite straightforward, and we will get practice this afternoon in our workshop in writing them. Sometimes, if you Google Bloom's taxonomy doesn't come up. What does come up is a taxonomy written by Anderson and Prattwall in 2001. Now, if you remember Bloom's taxonomy, Bloom wrote his book in 1955, over 50 years ago. And since that time, it has been used in all teacher training courses. When I was being trained to be a science teacher, and I spent something like 20 years teaching in a high school before I moved to teach at university, we learned all about Bloom's taxonomy, and we used Bloom's taxonomy when preparing our lessons. And now that I'm involved in teacher training, we again use Bloom's taxonomy to write the learning outcomes for each lesson that our student teachers use. So when I saw a book in 2001 coming out on Bloom's taxonomy, I said, this is great. Somebody has updated. They've given Bloom's taxonomy a fresh coat of paint. But I was very disappointed. In fact, I was sorry I didn't hold on to my €50 rather than buying the book and just have a look at it in the library before buying it. Because they spent the whole book talking about whether synthesis and evaluation should switch places. And they said that creation was the highest one and evaluation was lower down. So it was very disappointing, but one thing it did teach me was that even after 50 years, if this was the only suggested change that they thought could be made, it showed that Bloom's taxonomy had stood the test of time. Now, they waited until Bloom died before they published their book, because I don't think Bloom would have approved. Bloom died, I think it was 1999. This book was published in 2001. I think Bloom is right. In synthesis, Bloom used the word create as one of the active verbs. So Bloom already had creation in synthesis. And Bloom said evaluation was at the very top. And I think he's right, because if you create something, what's the point in creating something if when you stand back, you do not have the ability to evaluate your creation? So Bloom is perfectly in order as a result. Bloom wrote a second book about 2 years after the first. if you remember, his first book was in the cognitive domain, or the thinking domain. The second book he wrote was in the feeling, or the affective domain. And if I show you some of the active verbs for the affective domain, you may be able to see where I'm heading. If you look at those active verbs like appreciate and integrate, you will see, and judge and so on, or value, you will see that the affective domain is all about values and ethics. Now, this applies particularly to those of you who have students who enter certain professions. For example, your students may go into the medical profession or the nursing profession, where they are dealing with people. Your students might go into social science, where they are dealing with children and young adults and so on. If one looks there at the examples of learning outcomes in the affective domain, look what they have in common. Accept the need for ethical standards, appreciate the need for confidentiality, display a willingness to communicate well with patients, and so on. You know, embrace a responsibility for the welfare of children. All of these have to do with attitudes and values. So Bloom's Learning Outcomes book was another great success, because it helps us to write learning outcomes for those for whom the affective domain is applicable. Bloom recognized a third domain, and this domain, it's a funny old name, a psychomotor domain. Psycho meaning the mind, and motor meaning movement. So it has to do with skills, hand and eye skills particularly. And examples of learning outcomes in the psychomotor domain would be things like laboratory skills, operating materials in the laboratory, instrumentation, for example. Clinical skills, you know, like for example in nursing, perform a venipuncture, that a nurse can give you an injection without you bleeding to death. You know, that's skill. Right? And presentation skills, that you have the ability to make a presentation. And you could test that in your students by asking them to give a presentation to their peers about a project that they have done, for example. Now, what does a module look like in terms of the writing of learning outcomes? Well, one of the people who undertook my training course was Dr. Eleanor O'Sullivan of the dentistry department. And Eleanor is involved in training dentists. And Eleanor went on to do a master's in teaching and learning with us at the university. And if you look at the learning outcomes that she has written for her module, you'll see some interesting things. Now, in our computer system in the university, there is one sentence before each list of learning outcomes. On successful completion of this module, students should be able to. Now, that is put in there to give our professors a prompt. They should be able to do something. So it's to help them to make sure that each of those sentences begins with an active verb. And if you look at the learning outcomes that Eleanor has written, you'll see words like summarize, formulate an appropriate treatment plan, arrange appropriate tests, administer local anesthetics. That's one on the psychomotor domain. Okay, recognize, evaluate, and manage medical emergencies, differentiate, and so on. So a lot of those learning outcomes are from the higher order thinking skills, because these are final year dentists, look, 5th year dental students. And she wants to make sure that these dental students can synthesize what they've learned in biochemistry, in physiology, in study of bacterial infections and so on, to synthesize all of this material in order to treat a patient. So, whereas the ECTS system is, we said, a common currency for education, learning outcomes is the common language that we're going to learn about today. And it is also very clear on what a learning outcome is. Now, I want to mention this word, competency. In some training courses, I don't have to cover competency at all, because competency is not used in many countries. So when I was training my own colleagues in all of the universities in Ireland, the word competency never arose, because we do not use competency in Ireland for writing module descriptions or course descriptions. But in some countries, they do use competency, and I want to clarify now the distinction between competency and learning outcomes. There are challenges, of course, of beginning the task of writing learning outcomes. So I'll come back to this word competency, just hold it in the back of your mind for a moment. So the challenges of beginning task is that we must make sure that learning outcomes are clearly written. We must make sure that we focus on the students. So it's important that we have this framework in the back of our mind that this is what the students are able to do. And it's important that we keep our learning outcomes simple. The general guidance in the literature is that for every short course, you should write about 5 to 8 learning outcomes. So module learning outcomes should be a maximum of about 8. In our university, we allow our professors to write 9, but if they go more than 9, we say you are being too specific. You need to bring back the number of learning outcomes to the recommended number. Now, there are lots of words of advice in the literature about writing learning outcomes, and they all say the same. It's important to avoid certain verbs. The most common mistake that we find with learning outcomes is that the people who write them forget the difference between the teacher-centered approach using aims and objectives and the student-centered approach. And they use the language of aims and objectives when writing learning outcomes. Now that slide there shows some quotations from literature from all over the world. And look what they say. Look, avoid words like know, understand, and be familiar with. These are vague words. Supposing I am about to give you a lesson, and I say the objective of this lesson is to help the students in front of me to understand magnetism. Now that's quite vague, because my understanding of magnetism and your understanding and somebody else's understanding could all be different. However, if I say, at the end of this lesson, students should be able to define what a magnet is, explain how magnets are manufactured, list the types of metals used in making magnets, discuss the use of magnets in our everyday lives, in our mobile phones, in our motors, in our machinery, and so on. By listing out the learning outcomes, I'm bringing clarity to this word understand. So we cannot use the words like know, understand, or be familiar with. We cannot use those when writing learning outcomes. So in the book, I have a sort of a checklist for reminding you that when writing learning outcomes, you must avoid certain terms. The second point there that I have is try to include learning outcomes across the full range of the taxonomy. Now, with a first-year university group, you might be spending the time building up their knowledge and understanding before you can move up to the analysis and synthesis. But even in first year, you should try to include some active verbs from the higher order thinking skills. So, what were the learning outcomes that I set for this talk? Well, hopefully, at the end of this talk, you should be able to discuss why learning outcomes have become the international language of education, in terms of the Bologna process, in terms of not only does it involve the countries that have signed up to the Bologna process, the 46 countries, but also countries throughout the world. Hopefully, you should all be able to describe what is meant by the term learning outcome, a statement of which a student should, a statement summarising what a student should know, understand, and be able to do at the end of a teaching and learning experience. So, a simple definition of learning outcome. Hopefully, you should be able to see how Bloom's taxonomy can help us to write learning outcomes. And finally, you should be able to apply Bloom's taxonomy to help you to write learning outcomes. So that concludes the first presentation. I believe our program says that we have until 11:15 to 11:30 for questions and answers, and I think we're just coming up to 11:15 within a minute or two. So that enables us to spend the next 15 minutes answering questions. So I'll hand back to our chairman if they would like to chair the session on questions. Would that be okay? Right.
Yes, certainly. Well, I'm sure that the audience was listening to you very attentively, and some questions